They won't find anything unless they move the concrete. This phrase sent police into a frenzy. As they spent hours upon hours digging up grass, dirt, and animal bones, they finally found what they were dreading: human remains. Dental records confirmed that these remains belonged to Zoe Campos, but piecing together what happened to her, that was a different task entirely. How is it that an ordinary day with friends could have ended so badly? Well, it turns out you can't trust anyone, and certainly not your friends. Welcome to True Crime Stories. I'm your host, Ty Knotts, and I post new true crime documentaries every single week. So if you're interested in simple, classic true crime, then you've come to the right place, because that's pretty much all we do here. So be sure to subscribe. It's completely free, and it just keeps you up to date with my future videos. Zoe Campos was born on September 4th of 1995 and was the youngest of 3 siblings. Her dad, Alejandro, was in the Marines, so because of this, the Campos family traveled a lot. Right after Zoe was born, the family would bounce from place to place, from Honolulu, Hawaii, to Round Rock, Texas, and even San Diego, California. Before long, the Campos family made it to Lubbock, Texas, which was their permanent home. And this was also the time when Zoe's parents, unfortunately, went their separate ways, and Zoe dealt with all the emotion and trauma that comes along with a major family shift like this. Zoe, even as a young girl, had a huge heart, and she just wanted to help all the animals out there, which is why she'd often bring home stray animals and insist that her family help nurse them back to health and give them a home. This seems to have been a recurring theme for her, and her mom recalls multiple times when Zoe would just show up with a new animal to care for. Zoe, by the time she turned 18, was extremely responsible. She didn't get into trouble, she wasn't a party child, and she was on her way to do great things. She had multiple dreams that she was considering pursuing. Obviously, she wanted to help animals, but she also had a pretty serious interest in the automotive world too, and was considering becoming something along the lines of a mechanic. But one night in November of 2013 would end all of these dreams in the blink of an eye. Because after a night out with friends, Zoe would never come home. November 17th of 2013 was a busy day for Zoe. She spent the day at home, but as evening rolled around, she actually had plans of visiting her friend, April, who had just given birth. Now, we all know that Zoe loved children, animals, and babies, so she was not going to miss out on this. April had invited some of her other friends, too, and it was more like a little gathering at her house for everyone to meet the newest addition of her family. So Zoe left April's house at 9 p.m., but she still had other plans after that. She met up with her sister, Savannah, and the kids for dinner, and after that, they were going to rent a movie and spend the night at Savannah's. This was Zoe's definition of a perfect night: meeting an adorable baby, coming back home to her sister and her kids, having dinner with them, watching a movie, maybe having a late night snack, and then calling it a night. Life couldn't get any better for Zoe, but it would end in tragedy. After the movie ended, all of them went to bed, and Zoe was going to sleep on the couch. The next morning, on November 18th, Savannah came out of her bedroom ready for work when she noticed that Zoe was nowhere to be seen. Now, this was slightly alarming for Savannah, because Zoe wasn't the type of person to just up and leave without telling anyone. So Savannah did the first thing that came to her mind, and she called Zoe, but she wasn't picking up her phone. When Savannah looked out the window, she noticed that Zoe's car was gone, so she figured that maybe Zoe left it in the middle of the night for some reason. The next thing Savannah did was call her mom, Melinda, who was working at a local bar the night before. Now, this was when Savannah got to know about a strange event that confirmed that Zoe had indeed left the house the night before. See, Melinda was working her shift when, at around 2:30 a.m., she received a message from none other than Zoe. It was a bit unusual, but it wasn't anything alarming. Zoe just asked her mom if she needed a ride home. Now, for some context, Melinda's car was at a repair shop, so she was actually grateful that Zoe was coming to pick her up. But the thing is, Zoe never came. Melinda waited for her daughter outside the bar for almost 30 minutes and kept calling her, but there was no answer. Melinda wasn't too worried, because she thought that maybe Zoe had just fallen asleep, so Melinda made the short walk to her friend's house and spent the night there. But when she got the call from Savannah and she realized that no one had heard from Zoe, that was when both women started to get anxious. They called everywhere: Zoe's friends, local hospitals, but no one had seen or heard from Zoe. That was when Melinda and Savannah called the police at around 5 p.m. But the detectives were in no hurry to make a missing person report. They pulled the classic police maneuver and said that Zoe may have run away and was just blowing off steam somewhere. The detectives wanted to wait 24 hours before they officially reported her missing, which is unacceptable no matter the circumstances. Melinda and Savannah tried to reason with the investigators and stressed that Zoe would never just leave like that. She had no reason to. But did the detectives listen? Well, of course not. They did exactly what they said, and they refused to list her as a missing person until the following day. But then they later put out an APB for Zoe's Lincoln Town car. They didn't have to wait long, though, because Zoe's aunt, Monica, saw her car on the road the following day. Now, since the windows were tinted, she couldn't make out the driver's face, but she knew for sure that it wasn't Zoe. According to Monica, it looked like a 20-something-year-old male was wearing a hoodie and driving her car. She and her son followed the car, but ended up losing sight of it when it made a turn, and then it was nowhere to be seen. Eventually, the car was found abandoned at Driftwood Apartments, which just so happened to be the apartments where Zoe was living. Monica called the police and notified them of this discovery, and when the detectives got there, they searched the car, but there was no sign of Zoe. This was equal parts dreadful and relieving for Monica, because she'd been tailing this car, fearing that Zoe may have somehow been trapped inside the car by the driver. But reality still haunted everyone. Zoe was nowhere, and she just vanished without a trace. But what the investigators did find in the car was duct tape, Zoe's black jacket, an unknown sweatshirt that probably belonged to the man, and a phone charger. All of this was taken, and the clothes were sent for forensic testing. In the meantime, the detectives also went through Zoe's phone records, and even though they couldn't find the exact location where her phone was, they could pinpoint the last known activity on her phone, and it was near a place called Lowry Field. Now, what you should know about Lowry Field is that it is not a safe place. It is sketchy at best. There's a lot of criminal dealings and adult work in the area, so imagine the surprise of Zoe's family when they found out that her last known location was near this area. Now, considering Zoe was about as clean-cut as it gets, she most definitely wasn't involved in adult work or any other type of crime for that matter. So why would she be here of all places? Was she kidnapped? Did someone lure her there? And was she even still alive? As the police were trying to figure things out, they wanted to talk to all of the people in Zoe's life. The first person of interest was Zoe's ex-boyfriend, Joe. He and Zoe dated for a long time before mutually calling it quits. There was no bad blood between them, and Joe was genuinely worried for Zoe and where she could be. And also, Joe had an airtight alibi the night that Zoe went missing. The next person was another young man named Jacob. Zoe had also dated him for a while before finding out that he cheated on her, which resulted in them breaking up. Even though Jacob and Zoe were in contact in the days leading up to her disappearance, he also had a pretty solid alibi for the night. And even though he was your typical bad boy who always got into trouble, there was no evidence that could convince the detectives that Jacob had anything to do with Zoe's disappearance. The next person on the radar was a guy named Ben. Interestingly enough, Ben was someone Melinda dated. So why was he getting questioned by the police? Well, from Zoe's phone records, it showed that Zoe made a call to none other than Ben the night that she went missing. But why? The investigators called him in for questioning and a polygraph test, but they hit a dead end yet again because Ben also had a solid alibi, and he also didn't seem dodgy or closed off during the investigation. If anything, he was just as worried as everyone else. So the detectives were back to square one. But there was one more thing they had to look into, and that was April's hangout that Zoe went to. They wanted to speak to anyone and everyone at the party. Maybe there was someone who'd seen Zoe with another person. Maybe they could provide more details as to how Zoe was behaving before she disappeared. If she was scared, if she was her normal self, all the basic questions. So that was when everyone from the party was questioned, and one of them was Carlos Rodriguez. He was initially questioned by the police on November 25th, and he gave his version of events. Carlos was a friend of a friend who basically knew Zoe through a mutual friend, and they didn't really know each other very well personally, but they were friends with one another for sure. Carlos also said that he and Zoe left around the same time, and he didn't know what happened from that moment onwards. Now, you may think that this was another dead end, and the detectives were just wasting their time looking in the wrong direction. Carlos didn't really know Zoe, so he couldn't possibly know what happened to her, right? Well, something about Carlos and his story didn't sit right with the police. They couldn't do anything about it because they lacked evidence, but they decided to keep tabs on this guy just in case. 2 weeks later, on December 9th, Carlos was called back to the police station for another interview. And this time in a sworn statement, Carlos's story changed completely. Carlos went on to admit that what he said on November 25th was a complete lie. Carlos did in fact meet Zoe afterward, but not in the way you think. They added each other on Facebook and then chatted there. Carlos invited Zoe over to his house where they would smoke illegal substances. Now, Carlos admitted that he wanted to be friends with Zoe, or something more, and he just wanted to have a good time with her. He said that Zoe did come over that night, but Carlos didn't have any illegal substances on him. So Zoe left to get some for them, but she never came back. Now, this was bizarre. First of all, and I know I sound like a broken record, but Zoe didn't dabble in illegal substances, so how would she know where to find them at the most ungodly hour of the night? Second, even though Carlos swore up and down that he had nothing to do with Zoe's disappearance, even though he was technically the last person to be with her, this was classic suspect behavior, and the detectives knew that. If that wasn't suspicious enough, can you take a guess where Carlos's house was? Well, if you said Lowry Field, then you'd be absolutely right. If you remember, Zoe's last known location was within 1 mile of Lowry Field. But it wasn't going to be easy for the investigators to convict Carlos of whatever he did to Zoe, because there was no physical evidence that could tie him to her disappearance. So the detectives had to question Carlos again and again, in hopes that maybe he would slip up and give more details. In the meantime, Carlos's house was also searched by the police, but since Carlos had recently moved out, a lot of things had changed, and finding evidence was getting harder and harder. But do you remember the male sweatshirt that was found in Zoe's car? Well, it turned out that belonged to Carlos. And get this, forensic tests confirmed that DNA found on that jacket belonged to Zoe. So Carlos couldn't deny it any longer. He was with Zoe the night she disappeared. But as much as I hate to say this, the investigation for Zoe's disappearance went on for years after this. Zoe disappeared in November of 2013, and now it was nearing a little over 4 years later when Carlos was questioned for the upteenth time. But this time around, the interview was held at the Lubbock County Correctional Center. Now, why, you ask? Well, it turns out that Carlos was now serving a sentence there. He was charged with stalking an ex-girlfriend of his, so you can already guess what a guy Carlos was by this point. It also turns out for 4 years, this guy withheld information about Zoe when the police were certain that he knew more than he was letting on. It wasn't until July of 2018 when an inmate from the same correctional center where Carlos was came to the detectives with some very disturbing information. He said that during a conversation with Carlos about his home getting searched, Carlos flat out said, quote, they wouldn't find anything until they moved the concrete. This was the biggest lead in Zoe's case so far, and the investigators immediately went to Carlos's former home to do exactly what they had to do, move the concrete. With the help of cadaver dogs, the detectives honed in on a particular area in the backyard, presumably an area that had been covered by concrete. But oddly enough, the police never actually mentioned finding any concrete. But soon enough, when they dug around, they came across some bones. They were horrified by this discovery. Without wasting any time, the police sent the remains for testing, but the results were not what they expected. The remains were not human. They were animal remains. This was very depressing and anticlimactic for the police. They get one lead from this uncooperative person, and even that goes nowhere. But the detectives decided to play a little game with Carlos. Now sure, the remains weren't Zoe's, but the investigators were certain that they just needed to find the right place to look for them. So the investigators revisited Carlos again and started again asking some questions. During the questioning, the detectives casually brought up the bones found in his backyard, hoping to get a reaction out of him. Luckily, they did. It was like the police could see Carlos shutting down right in front of them. He was panicking, but he calmly asked for an attorney, and he said he wouldn't be cooperating with the detectives anymore, as if he ever cooperated in the first place. But this reaction was all the investigators needed. The interesting thing is that even the detectives didn't know that the bones were animal remains at this point, because the test results hadn't come back by then. Yet they still poked Carlos for more information with this tactic. It was a pretty smart move. They knew for sure that Carlos had done something terrible to Zoe, and as much as they were horrified to think about it, they now knew that Carlos's backyard hid more than just animal bones. 5 years after Zoe's disappearance, Carlos was finally ready to confess. In his mind, the police had already found Zoe's remains, and the detectives let him think that. So this is what happened to Zoe the night before she tragically lost her life. We already know by now that Zoe and Carlos agreed to meet up at his house. Some sources also said that once they got to his house, things got intimate between the two. But what actually happened next was that they smoked cigarettes that had been laced with a highly illegal substance. Now, I'm not sure whether Zoe knew that these cigarettes contained this substance, if she was forced to do them, or if she did it of her own free will, we just don't know. But let me just say, what these cigarettes were laced with was an incredibly psychoactive chemical. This wasn't the typical stuff that you can buy variations of at a local gas station. This was the kind of stuff that'll send you straight to another planet, causing intense hallucinations and a complete loss of your grip on reality. Carlos confessed that after smoking, he turned to look at Zoe, but he didn't see her sitting in front of him. Rather, he saw a demon, and this terrified him. As a result, he struck Zoe with all of his might before taking her life with his bare hands. Once he knew that Zoe was no longer alive, Carlos dug a shallow grave in his backyard and buried Zoe's body. I guess after he came down from the high, he realized what he had done. Because what was interesting was that a couple months later, Carlos actually dug Zoe back up and buried her deeper in the backyard so that no one would find her. So Carlos hallucinated and saw Zoe morphing into a demon, or so he says. But he was coherent enough to bury her in his backyard right afterward? That's the part that doesn't add up. If he was as far gone as he claims to be, this man wouldn't have been able to even lift a shovel, let alone dig a grave. Now don't get me wrong, some hardcore substances can cause wild hallucinations, but it's just so infuriating to think that Carlos, instead of snapping out of his haze or asking for help, thought that the most reasonable option would be to end Zoe's life, then just cover everything up. It's just so unbelievable, but I guess in his mind, everything was going to be fine because he was never going to get caught. But he would never have guessed how wrong he truly was. Carlos was taken to the backyard of his former home, and after pointing out the exact location and digging, on November 16th of 2018, the detectives found another set of remains. And unfortunately this time, they weren't animal remains. Dental records confirmed that the remains did indeed belong to 18-year-old Zoe Campos. Carlos was immediately arrested and charged with Zoe's murder. Carlos, the master of dragging things out for impossibly long periods, pleaded not guilty, so now he was awaiting trial behind bars. In the meantime, he wrote a letter to the media, basically confirming the fact that he ended Zoe's life, and his letter was filled with details on what he did to Zoe and how sorry he was for what he did. Infuriatingly, Carlos went ahead and said that the guilt of keeping this a secret was weighing on him. Yet he continued to keep his little secret, and to top this off, he still pleaded not guilty. That's the part that really blows my mind. He all but confessed to the crime in the media, yet in court still claimed he was innocent. It doesn't even make sense. But hold on, because this next bit will make your blood boil even more. Carlos went on to address the Campos family and apologize to them for their loss. But still, Carlos stressed that he is not a murderer and that it was the hallucinations that made him do this in the first place. But Carlos, correct me if I'm wrong, but you made a choice to smoke the substance, knowing full well what it was capable of. In my book, that makes you fully responsible for whatever happens after the fact. But all this aside, he begged the Campos family to forgive him and not seek revenge. His exact words were, quote, "Just remember, don't seek revenge, seek justice. Don't hate your enemies, love and forgive them." I am truly, honestly, at a complete loss of words. But let's just get back to the trial, because this nuisance deserves to suffer behind bars for what he did to Zoe. The trial was held in 2022, and the jury wasted no time in coming to a decision. 29-year-old Carlos Rodriguez was found guilty of murdering Zoe Campos, and he was sentenced to life in prison. It only took the jury 14 minutes to determine the sentence. 14 minutes. That's how guilty this man was. Zoe's family felt like they were hit by a tidal wave when they found out that the investigators had recovered her remains. Her mom and sister were so devastated by what happened to Zoe. To not see or hear from your child for more than 5 years, living in this pit of uncertainty and dealing with leads that were more and more horrific as they went, these 5 years have been brutal for Zoe's family. The only silver lining is that they got to bring Zoe home and lay her to rest peacefully. Zoe's funeral was held on December 4th of 2018, and everyone said their final goodbyes to a young woman who would have been a pet lover, a dang good mechanic, and a source of joy for everyone. Zoe's mom, Melinda, misses her daughter's warm smile and voice terribly. Melinda said that planning her daughter's funeral was the hardest, most heartbreaking thing in her life, and she prays that no parent ever goes through this. We can only hope that the Campos family finds peace after this tremendous loss, because there are literally no words to describe how awful this case was. Illegal substances are bad enough, and they can ruin lives in every sense of the word. Even if Carlos initially had no intentions of harming Zoe, it's just another glaring example of why drugs are so incredibly catastrophic, and how losing yourself in them will only lead to heartache, one way or the other. Thank you guys for tuning in to another episode of True Crime Stories. I want to give a special thank you to a few channel members, including Jennifer Plata, Laura Peterson, Whoever You Want Me to Be, and Katrina Seldenwright. If you also want to become a member of the channel, you'll gain access to new videos sometimes days or weeks before they're uploaded to the public, and it is a great way to support the channel and help out. I really appreciate all of you that have decided to do that. If you want to join, you can click that big join button below the video, or find the link down in the description. And don't forget, True Crime Stories t-shirts are also now available. You can grab one of those from a link down in the description as well. But as always, if you enjoyed this video, check out this other interesting case I covered. And don't forget to subscribe. It's totally free and just keeps you up to date with all my future videos. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.